This is Robert Sapolsky, and you're listening to Father-Offspring Interviews.
Ahoy! Welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews. We're starting with a question from Canada. What are the common characteristics for how hunter-gatherers raise kids compared to how weird kids are raised? What differences are there in the results? Can any claim to be better in certain aspects of raising kids?
Hunter-gatherers. Anyone who has sat through a bunch of these episodes by now will be virtually able to say word for word my next sentence, which is for 99% of hominin history, humans have been living as hunter-gatherers long before domestication of animals, long before agriculture, about 2 million years of humans living in small mobile bands of hunter-gatherers. So the question is, how did their parenting techniques compare with contemporary weird people? Weird, acronym from various episodes, WEIRD, individuals who are westernized, educated from industrialized, rich, democratic cultures. So child rearing. And the answer is nobody knows, because nobody knows how child rearing was occurring a million years ago. So what's the proxy instead? To study the handful of contemporary hunter-gatherers to get some sort of sense of that. And the second you mentioned that, you got to bring in the provisos that contemporary hunter-gatherers are not the same folks as 100,000 years ago. For one thing, they got neighbors who were agriculturalists, who were pastoralists. For another, they've probably spent the last 10,000 years as hunter-gatherers, having their rear ends kicked in by agriculturalists and pastoralists, pushed into really degraded habitats, desert, things like that. They often have trading relations with the neighboring agriculturalist and pastoralist. So there's no such thing as a pure hunter-gatherer anymore. Nonetheless, there's a handful of cultures that have been studied intensively, and the golden era of studying hunter-gatherers is over with. Basically, it was the 1960s to 1980s. What happened after that? More and more contact with the outside world, missionaries, getting people to be sedentary, to stop being nomadic, and much of the research since then has been how they have weathered the transition. Okay, nonetheless, there were a few decades of studies, pioneering studies, and these were often people, anthropologists, who've spent their entire careers studying some of these groups. Without question, these superstars of contemporary hunter-gatherers are the Kalahari San, also known as the Kung, often back when pejoratively known as Bushmen, Kalahari Desert in Botswana. These are folks where, like, if you're on Amazing Race, they may send you to hang out with them and watch them make scorpions docile by licking them and things like that. These are the superstars, the most studied. That's probably not really the case, but as an undergrad in a bioanthropology department, I happened to be living sort of ground zero in a department that did Kung Kalahari research while I was thinking about baboons, so I've gotten a bit brainwashed as to how interesting they are. Okay, so the Kalahari Kung, the other groups that have been heavily studied, the Hadza hunter-gatherers of northern Tanzania, and we've heard about them. Kristen Hawkes from a few weeks ago, The Grandmother Effect, has studied them. Nick Bullerton-Jones as well has spent a career with them. The Efi of the Congo Basin, often historically pejoratively known as pygmies, the Ituri Efi, studied principally by Robert Bailey, Nadine Peacock of University of Illinois, Chicago. And then in the New World, there are the Ache, hunter-gatherers in the Amazonian rainforest of Paraguay, principally studied by Kim Hill and Magdalena Hurtado. Okay, so These are the people who have spent years looking at them, and depending on your taste, what's come out of that is either a consistent or a wildly, subtly nuanced picture of different parenting styles. Of course, there's all the debates about the subtle differences among these different populations. Nonetheless, what is consistent is childhood is real different in these hunter-gatherer societies than they are in our world, or traditional agriculturalists or pastoralists. Okay, so focusing first on the first few years of life, what are some of the characteristics? Enormous amounts of physical contact of the kid with mom. For example, among the Kung, women carry their babies around in a hip sling, and in the first year of life, they are having skin to skin contact about 70% of the time. And by year two, about 30%. This was work of Carol Worthman, Harvard, then Emory University looking at this, Marjorie Shostak. And this is way, way more than you see among weird people in the West. What else do you see going on in the early years? A much shorter latency among all these populations. How long does a kid cry before they are picked up? A lot shorter time than typically in the West. What else? Allomothering, which is to say, your typical hunter-gatherer baby is cared for by all sorts of other women in the group. Among the FA people in the Congo, for example, the numbers ranged from the first year of life, baby was cared for by anywhere between 5 and 24 other women, depending on the group, usually relatives, but not necessarily an extended community of childcare. Where the most interesting differences come in is with nursing patterns. And this is most studied in the Kung. And this was work heavily done again by Carol Worthman and Mel Connor, who was my academic advisor when I was an undergrad and has probably influenced my thinking more than anyone in my life. But he did some of his research on the Kung having to do with nursing patterns. Okay, so a totally different picture there, which is what happens in the West. Typical westernized woman, if she's nursing, and that is far from 100% of the time, but if she is, she gives birth, she starts nursing her child for, I don't know, 5 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever. And within a few months, the pattern is 3, 4 times a day, maybe 1 or 2 nursing bouts at night, typically 12 months or so, most people have stopped nursing in the West, and this is utterly different than life for a Kalahari Kung woman who has her first child. She's usually around 14 or 15, picks up the kid, and the kid nurses for about 30 seconds every 30 minutes around the clock for the next 3 to 4 years. A totally different pattern. And all sorts of interesting implications of this. For one thing, what you've got then is you don't have weaning conflict. What you have is a gradual transition to the kid both nursing and eating solid foods, usually chewed up by mom and then fed to the kid. But this going on for years. Really interesting implication of this. So note, this is 2 to 4 times an hour around the clock, including at night. The kid is sleeping with mom for the first few years of life, much longer than in the West. And at night, the kid just sort of wakes up every now and then and nurses for a while, and mom doesn't even wake up. And of course, the anthropologists are sitting there with the stopwatches and the night viewing goggles, but everybody else is perfectly at ease. You have nursing around the clock on demand. And an interesting consequence of that, you nurse like in the West typically, and you have nursing bouts every few hours or so. And what happens is within a few seconds of starting to nurse, the levels of the hormone prolactin, which is pro-lactational, go up, and then after the nursing bout, they go back down again. And a few hours later, they go up again. In contrast, if you are a Kung woman, you pick up your newborn and they nurse and they start nursing 4 times an hour, prolactin levels go up and they stay up for the next 4 years. And that's really interesting because prolactin, when it's secreted in that sort of pattern, is very, very much an anti-reproductive hormone. It suppresses ovulation in women. Oh, what's the best way to suppress ovulation is birth control, nursing. Oh my God, old wives' tales. According to the World Health Organization, more pregnancies are prevented each year by nursing than every other form of contraception out there. All you got to do is do it the way humans have probably been doing it for 2 million years, which is short bouts around the clock for years. Prolactin levels boost up and stay up there. And this was the work of Connor and Worthman showing prolactin patterns are completely different. What comes out of that? About a 3 to 5 year birth interval between kids. And this produces something very interesting. Just to digress here. Okay, so you're a Kung woman. You hit puberty, maybe, I don't know, you've had a half dozen cycles. You're married by then before you have your first kid. And you go 3, 4, 5 years without having cycles because you've been nursing continuously like this. And the kid finally weans and they're 3 years old. They're in the little league game and they just come over to nurse for 30 seconds from mom and they go back out to the outfield or whatever. And the woman has not been ovulating. 3, 4 years later, the kid is weaned and a half dozen cycles or so, and the woman gets pregnant again. Another 3 to 5 year gap. When you look at someone like that over the course of her lifetime, 20, 30 total number of menstrual cycles. And in contrast, typically westernized women, 3, 4, 500 or so. And you see the basic evolution of reproductive physiology in women was based on women having 20, 30 cycles over their lifetime, not in an order of magnitude more. There's been much speculation that among the consequences of this are some of the gynecological and obstetric diseases that are more common in westernized women. For example, endometriosis seems to be related to that. The more cycles you've had, the greater odds of it happening. Okay, so that's a very different world, a very different world. As the kid gets older, it's an equally different world as well. There's no school, there's no instruction getting some learned graybeard who sits there and very intentionally directs knowledge at kids who are supposed to sit still there and absorb it all. Is an invention of the last 500, last 1,000 years. No, that's not how hunter-gatherer kids learn. They learn it through observation of their parents. They learn it through experience. They learn it through age-graded peer groups. Your typical hunter-gatherer kid, when they are off 3, 4, 5 years old, now running around, they are spending all day long with their cousins and their close other relatives and some unrelated kids who just a group of them who are ranging from ages 4 to 7 or 8 or so. And they basically spend the day on their own, exploring stuff. What do they explore? They explore being sort of junior hunter gatherers. They go and they gather some stuff, or they begin to learn how to use a bow and arrow. Or great picture here, some Hadza kids, 2 girls very young, who've built a kindergarten version of a Hadza hut that they're learning how to do. Very, very different. Virtually no punishment on the part of parents, virtually no weaning conflict. Another interesting thing about it is the notion of adolescence being a time of life full of Sturm und Drang and heartache and all that is mostly a Western invention. It doesn't occur there. What do you get? You get very different sorts of adults, where the last thing on earth is the notion of wanting to pick up and prove your independence and move off. You will spend your whole life in the general area of where you grew up with your parent. Very different sort of picture. So that brings us, of course, to the second part of the question, which is, so who's better? Who raises better kids? Those hunter-gatherers or us westernized folks? Which has a better outcome? And before you get all excited and are ready to get your Hadza FA parenting video and go follow it kind of thing, there's a very simple answer. And this is something that's been emphasized by the anthropologist Meredith Small, author of the book Our Babies Ourselves: How Biology and Culture Shape the Way We Parent. And she makes a very simple point, which is every culture on earth, if they're doing a good job at parenting, what they do is they produce kids who have the same values as the parents and the culture. Maybe you want your kid to become an amazing camel herder. Maybe you want your kid to become a cutthroat CEO of some startup or a Trappist monk or who knows what. In different cultures, people raise kids to be sharing their values, and there's no who does it better sort of thing. If you want to wind up having the values of a Kalahari hunter-gatherer, that's how you do it. If you want to wind up being somebody who's already 3 startups in Silicon Valley before they've graduated college, success there comes from a very different model of upbringing.
Next, Jim from Los Angeles says, in your lectures, you've talked about how it's the high ranking baboons that often experience the most stress and that chronic stress can fuel aggression. What are the underlying mechanisms behind that? And do we see similar behavioral changes like increased aggression or reduced empathy in humans that achieve high wealth and status?
Let's start off with one of the great misconceptions, myths of psychobiology, which is the executive stress syndrome. In the late 1950s, a guy named Joe Brady did an immensely influential study. He would take monkeys, a pair of monkeys, and in each pair, one of them was the executive. What's the executive? The monkeys would get shocks every now and then, and as long as the executive lever pressed, it decreased the likelihood of shocks for both of them. The executive had the responsibility for both of their well-beings, and what he saw was the executive monkeys in these conditions develop perforated ulcers, all sorts of stress-related diseases. Wait a second, ulcers, they're not about stress anymore. They certainly still are about stress, but that's a whole other story. But wildly influential study, and out of that came the view that in the corporate world, in any sort of hierarchical world, it's the people on top who were suffering the most stress. Turned out there was a design flaw in how the study was carried out, in that Brady kind of didn't randomly assign the monkeys as to who was the executive and who was the underling. He pre-screened the monkeys' personalities. The more emotionally reactive ones, he made the executives. Oh, the study was totally uninterpretable. What has come out since then? Something very different from this executive stress syndrome. You look at large corporations and who gets the most stress-related disease, not upper management, middle management does. Why? Because they have responsibility, but they don't have autonomy. Stuff gets dumped on them from above. That's the more typical picture. Okay, but now let's switch to baboons and begin to dissect what it means to be an alpha baboon, and is it stressful and when isn't? And what you see is the punchline is it depends. It depends on what the social context is. If you are an alpha male baboon during a period where there's rank instability and the hierarchy is upheaval and ranks are changing all over the place and lots of funny, under those circumstances, you have the highest levels of cortisol, the glucocorticoid stress hormone. Under circumstances where your number one and number two is breathing down your neck 24/7, you tend to have the highest levels of cortisol. You look at a troop when the hierarchy is stable, when nobody is challenging the alpha, and what you tend to see there is they've got the lowest levels. It's not your rank, it's the social meaning of the rank. So under those optimal conditions, why do you see low cortisol levels in these baboons, in these alpha baboons? And this taps into stuff we've been talking about in previous weeks. They've got all the psychological control. They've got control, they've got predictability, predictability, they have social support, they get groomed more, they get to mate more. They've got all the psychological advantages. And when they're not in the middle of a revolution, they're doing much better. Okay, but the picture gets a little darker at this point. What was the focus the other week? What are the psychological building blocks of stress? Loss of control, loss of predictability, loss of social support. And there's one other piece to that story, which is loss of outlets for your frustration. What does that look like? Take a rat, the rat gets shocked now and then, has no control over it, no nothing, and its blood pressure goes up, its stress hormone levels go up, its risk of an ulcer goes up. In contrast, you have a second rat getting the exact same shocks, but what it has after each shock is the option to go over to a bar of wood and gnaw on it with its teeth, and it doesn't get the ulcers and it doesn't get the stress response. It has an outlet for its frustration. Whoa, totally amazing. This was classic work by a guy named Jay Weiss, originally Rockefeller University, then Emory, and it had an elaboration on it, which is now slightly differently. You got the rat who's getting the shocks now and then, and now rather than a bar of wood, what it could do is go over to another rat who's sitting there and bite the crap out of it. And you know what? The first rat is not getting an ulcer. The second guy is plenty. The first rat is not, because he's able to displace aggression on somebody else. And this displacement of aggression is a theme among social animals all over the planet there. Baboons, just to stick with that example, about 50% of aggression is displacement aggression. What does that look like? Number two loses a fight to number one. So number two goes and chases number five, who lunges at number 12, who bites a female, who slaps a juvenile, all in 30 seconds. What does that mean? You're sitting there, you're minding your own business, looking at the clouds and the birds or whatever, and somebody else in a bad mood, if they're higher ranking, can take it out on you. Lack of control, lack of predictability. So some of the psychological advantages of dominance is not just control and predictability and social support. You could dump on lower ranking individuals. And the reason why this works, the reason why this is one of the greatest explanations for misery among all of Earth's mammals, is it reduces stress. If you have a socially stressed individual, the two surest routes to decrease secretion of stress hormones, like glucocorticoids, cortisol, the first one we've heard already many episodes ago. The first is go eat some food that's very high in fat and or sugar, because that's reducing of the stress response, stress-induced craving for junk food. There's a whole mechanism in the hypothalamus by which that works. The other most reliable thing is, if you are uptight and stressed, take it out on somebody smaller and weaker. And this reduces stress hormone levels. Among the baboons, for example, this was some of my work back when, you look at baboon personalities. That's not a silly term. Baboons have personalities, stable differences in temperament and responsive styles and such. And you look at baboons and you control for rank. And what you see is, independent of rank, you find lower stress hormone levels in baboons who have a lot of grooming partners. Oh, that's great and heartwarming. They've got social support. You also see lower stress hormone levels in the baboons who are most prone towards displacing aggression on smaller, weaker individuals. So we see this as a great outlet. And, the human versions are there very clearly. Spousal abuse, child abuse becomes more common when the economy has a downturn, when there's unemployment. One amazing study showing that when somebody's home team, football team, unexpectedly loses when they were favored to win, in the 12 hours afterward, the likelihood of spousal abuse goes up. Displacement aggression, where primates just like all the other ones. But the question had a broader theme in there. Forget the explicitness of dumping aggressively on someone of a lower status in your society. What about empathy and ethics in westernized worlds? When you look at it, are the wealthy as ethical, more ethical, less ethical than everybody else? And a fairly solid literature suggests that if you're going to get stuck in a phone booth, you don't want to do it with a billionaire because their behavior is less ethical, there's more displacement, there's less empathy. What does it look like? For example, the percentage of income that people spend on charity is much lower among the wealthy than among lower socioeconomic strata. When you look at people of different SES strata, people who are extremely wealthy tend to do worse at tests of theory of mind, thinking about somebody else's perspective. And that is a stepping stone for empathy. More wealthy people are more likely to do system justifying things like saying a certain amount of greed is good because it fuels the economy. What's most interesting, though, are actual experimental demonstrations of this. You take people of different SESs and they play economic games against each other. And for one thing, the wealthy are more likely to cheat at the games. But you do something subtler. You make people feel as if they are wealthy or poor. In studies like this, what you do is individuals start out with a certain amount of money and they can gain or lose. You start off unequally. You make somebody feel wealthy. They start off with more money than the other players in the game. You make them feel poor. They start off with less. And what you see is even within the context of an economic game, a competitive economic game, if you psychologically manipulate someone to feel as if they are of higher economic status of everyone else, they start cheating more. The most charming study that's been done with this was by the psychologist Dacher Keltner at UC Berkeley, wonderful scientist, great guy, who's done one of the most charming studies, which was looking at a great index of socioeconomic status. How expensive of a car is someone driving? And in this classic study, they looked at pedestrian crosswalks and did cars stop for the pedestrians? What was the likelihood of them stopping? And quick, write down what the model and year of the car is, how expensive it is. And what they showed, and here's a diagram from one of their studies, what they showed was as you got wealthier and wealthier people with their more expensive cars, they became astronomically unlikely to stop for somebody who is crossing in the crosswalk. They don't care as much, whether they don't care as much because they don't care about the other person or if they don't even notice them. But what you see is a very real life manifestation of that. The same study also showed the fancier, more expensive cars, the more likely they were to cut in line at a four-way street, jumping the queue and not taking their turn. So what do we see? We see whether you're a baboon, whether a human, dumping on somebody weaker is a good way to decrease stress and get all relaxed and meditative and zen and such. What you see within this very odd primate world of economic systems and money and socioeconomic ladders and such, the general pattern is the wealthy are less empathic and less pro-social than everybody else is.
Wrapping up today is a question from Debbie from the UK. There are increasing reports of poor metabolic health being causative for many health conditions, including dementia. Do you think this is a major contributor?
Absolutely. And in some very interesting ways, and built around a logical truism, some insult, disaster, catastrophe, whatever happens, how much damage is there at the end? And it's the outcome of two variables. How much of a disaster was the disaster? And what are the reserves, the resilience, the resources of the target of this disaster? What do I mean? There's an earthquake. What's going to be a consequence? Part of it is how severe the earthquake is, and part of it is how good the construction is of buildings, for withstanding earthquakes. There's a pandemic with a novel virus. And how many people is it going to kill? Well, what are the reserves? What percentage of the population is vaccinated? And, that's just not a random example, because the commandants who are running public health now are going to have a lot of blood on their hands because of vaccine policy. But I digress. Okay, so within the realm of something like dementia, let's look at the primary insult to the system and what reserves, what capacity does that brain have to resist that insult. And this is exactly where the question becomes relevant. Okay, let's restrict ourselves among all sorts of dementias. Let's just talk about Alzheimer's disease. And let's just talk about the 90% of cases that are called late onset sporadic, where they are not caused by a gene mutation. That's early onset, 10% of cases, but instead influenced by genes, influenced by lots of other stuff. So we're talking about late onset Alzheimer's disease. Let's start off by reviewing completely wrong information as follows. So, what's going on in Alzheimer's? There's two things that go wrong in the brain. These things called amyloid plaques, which form microscopic, you see in postmortem, and these things called neurofibrillary tangles. And the amyloid plaques are the things that cause the damage, and people have been focusing on that for years and years. And as research got more sophisticated, you could begin to see what was somebody's cognitive state before they died, how severe was their dementia, and then post-mortem, you could look at the brain and see how many amyloid plaques were there. And focusing on what amyloid was doing, which was killing neurons, how many dead neurons were there? And the logical thing you were going to see was the more amyloid, the more dead neurons, the more severe the dementia. You didn't see that. It wasn't a good fit. So what else came into it? And here was one of the charming studies in Alzheimer's disease, which was I'm forgetting the name of the guy who did the research, but at University of Minnesota, the nun study, studying elderly nuns, the perfect population to study, because they all live together. They've been living together, similar diets, similar medical care, usually not substance abuse, overall quite healthy. Looking at elderly nuns, the incidence of dementia, and these were nuns who had agreed to donate their brains afterward. And what you saw was, once again, not a very good correlation between how severe their dementia was before death and how much amyloid damage there was in the brain and how many dead neurons. You would have some of these women who turned out post-mortem to have extensive amyloid plaques and neuron loss, and yet they had hardly any dementia at all. Some, in other cases, exactly the opposite. What were some of the other variables that came into it? And this is where people started getting classic insights. The more education for the same degree of amyloid challenge to the brain, less chance of dementia. The more ongoing intellectual stimulation, the less chance of dementia. And now the critical one in terms of this question, the healthier the vasculature, the blood vessels in the brain, for the same extent of amyloid plaque load, less likely to have dementia if you had healthy circulation in the brain, cerebrovasculature. Why does the health of your cerebrovasculature matter? These are the blood vessels. They're delivering blood to your brain. They're delivering oxygen. They're delivering glucose, nutrients. They're feeding your brain. And if you have an unhealthy vascular system up there, if there's lots of little mini strokes, if they're clogged up with inflammatory plaques and things, if they get clogged, they're not delivering glucose and oxygen to the neurons that are sitting in the nest wanting to be fed glucose and oxygen just downstream. In addition, as you get vascular damage, you get inflammation there, you generate oxygen radicals, and that's damaging neighboring neurons. What do you wind up with? You got a neuron on the edge of a cliff teetering because of whatever Alzheimer's is doing to it to put it on the edge of this abyss there. And if on top of it, it's not getting a whole lot of glucose and oxygen and is getting kicked with more inflammation from the nearby blood vessels, it's that much more likely to go over the edge of the cliff. What that tells us is get a healthy cerebrovascular system in old age, and for the same extent of amyloid damage in the brain, you are less impaired afterward. Okay, just harking back many episodes ago, this was Alzheimer's Insights circa 2000 or something. Let's quickly bring this up to the current version. If you want to see the best predictor of how much cognitive impairment someone will have with Alzheimer's, it's not how many neurons have died, it's how many synapses have been lost. And this was careful, obsessive, pioneering work by a guy named Bob Terry at UC San Diego, showing it's the synapse loss that's really critical. Next bit of revisionism, people figured out the amyloid plaques, this amyloid protein that glommed into these hairballs of these big old tombstones of gunk. People figured out they, in fact, were not the damaging things. It was intermediate forms when you were just beginning to get the starting stages of these amyloid plaques called oligomers. Those were the things that were damaging synapses more than the amyloid plaques. Final bit of revisionism in the field, which is the realization after decades of people swearing by the amyloid story being what Alzheimer's is mostly about. People are kind of beginning to realize those things I mentioned in passing, those neurofibrillary tangles, that's really where the damage is coming from. Nonetheless, you take the most modern version and it's the same exact punchline. Whatever the most implicated mediator of damages in Alzheimer's disease, for the same amount of that mediator, your cerebrovascular health is going to modulate how severe of a dementia you have. And what this speaks to is what is ultimately fantastic news with Alzheimer's, with late onset sporadic Alzheimer's, because what the studies show is about 40% of the risk comes from lifestyle factors that could be changed. There's genetic influences. If you're talking about early onset Alzheimer's, you got the mutation. If you live long enough, you're going to have Alzheimer's. Absolute all or none. You look at late onset, and about 40% of the variability is explained by lifestyle. Did you smoke a lot? Did you drink a lot? Did you have histories of concussive head trauma, education, stimulation, social support? And another major mediator of it is, did you go into the period where your brain was now going to have to weather whatever was going wrong with healthy vasculature in your brain or not? And that's where healthy diet helps to play out in this.
And that's all for episode 77. I'm Offspring Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of science and the beard.